I want to thank Don, especially for organizing this, and thank you to Nora for hosting us here in Sweden, and to Nav for their beautiful space here. So today I'm going to be talking to you about interspecies circularity of agency. And I'll tell you a little bit about how I've recently gotten into this question again, which is one of the oldest questions of philosophy and biology. But I'll try to give a little different biosemiotic take from other previous biosemiotic takes on this. So I see biosemiotics as a compatibilist solution to the free will determinism issue, right? So here's just a basic diagram of the differences between forms of incompatibilism and compatibilism. So in a physical universe, one without life, there's this notion that things are deterministic or determined. Now we can argue about how they're determined, whether this is, Aristotle's unmoved mover, or if this is sort of a non-local, right, an emergent determinism. But we are pretty sure that with the advent of life, at the latest, that there's this thing called free will, right? This is the basis, origins of semiotics, right? The question of interpretation, and with the question of interpretation, the question of things being able to go differently, right? And so if we have a physics deterministic world, but sort of, you could say, or highly determined world, however it may be, and a question of life bringing in free will. And again, this isn't anything goes, like fraternity or sorority party free will, what John Stuart Mill would call license, but rather something more akin to actually a Kantian sort of autonomy. We have this compatible view that you can have sort of free will and determinism at the same time. But I'm interested here, especially given our times, that we have this question of symbiosis and antibiosis. Now, antibiosis means an antagonistic association between two organisms, especially microorganisms, but it's a general term, in which one is adversely affected. And being alive during our zeitgeist, I've been increasingly interested in antibiosis, or this is also alternatively been called dysbiosis. And I conjecture that we have this sort of Hegelian dialectic trap, where the more we try to assert our free will, our individualism, our autonomy, our independence from being part of a living world, and the more that we influence of other organisms from our own behavior, the more we are controlled by them in absentia. Now, of course, you'll hear echoes here of Terry's work in Incomplete Nature in using that term in absentia. But I'm very interested in this question of viruses as agents, as we're in the middle of a still in the middle of a pandemic, where viruses are very prominent actors in our world. But how can we think of them not as some sort of philosophical object, but as part of a living process? So when we think about the coronavirus, do we think of human-engineered gain-of-function escapees of a Wuhan lab? Do we think of the ability of zoonotic viruses to jump from bats or other mammals to humans? In so doing, how much agency do we grant to the virus itself? Do these different strains, for example, Delta, exist in reaction to us, just as super weeds develop when we try to kill them with Roundup, glyphosate, or antibiotic resistant bacteria come into being when societies overprescribe antibiotics? This sort of foreground and background shift, which Michael Pollan looked at in Botany of Desire, and Yuval Harari has also talked about with the domestication of humans by wheat. I find to be very not just charming or entertaining, but creating precisely this flip of background and foreground. And I'm interested in this presentation about discussing how we, as through our actions, through our little bit of free will, which is, you could say, our own, right? How we create the soil for different agents, how we curate the environment for different organisms or groups of organisms, as usually the case is. And right now, since industrialization, we've been really focused on killing off our mutualists and commensalists. Whether that's the forests and ecosystems that sustain us, or if that's our oceans, seeing them as endless cesspools, to dump our sludge, and before long, which is already happened, this has left us with a disproportionate amount of parasites, you could say, despite our success in having clean cities, clean streets, all of this, or maybe despite of it. So I'm arguing that we need to regenerate the capacities for our biological allies instead of feeding the mutations such as cancer or infectious diseases such as various viruses, bacteria, protists, nematodes, etc., that threaten our stability and flourishing, and realize that all of these entities live in a ecosystem, and that, for example, viruses in certain bloodstreams will remain dormant because the blood is more alkaline, whereas in a more acidic environment, they will spring to life and into action. So I was compelled by some work of the ethnobotanist Stephen Harold Booner, who wrote a passage I'll share with you about this question of interspecies agency. And he writes, oddly enough, the insistence on the lab leak comes out of an understanding that nature can be controlled. It can't. That if it could, we would be safe, which we aren't. In other words, if the scientists had left well enough alone, none of this would have happened, the story goes. Or if they had practiced better protocols, it would not have happened. The thing is, pandemics are inevitable. There are simply too many of us, and there's too much natural and ecosystems are beginning to fail. This always allows pathogen emergence. In fact, it is a form of protection from ecosystem overload. We're just an animal like all the others. If we put too much pressure on ecological systems, we'll pay for it. It's not personal, just as gravity is not personal if we drop a rock on our toe. It's just the thing that things work here. Should scientists be messing about with genetically altering organisms on this planet? No, they should not. As pandemic-capable pathogens? No, they should not. It is part of the hubris of the rationalists and their scientific priests, the scientists, which are themselves part of the most successful of the Protestant sects, science. And here he writes, crucially, you have to consider the possibility that instead of us deciding to alter the organisms in the lab, that the organisms decided to be altered in a human lab and simply used scientists who believed in human control to do it for them. This, of course, insults core rationalist beliefs, but there's far more going on here than rationalists can accept. Earth is not as insentient as the rationalists and monotheists believe, nor are our companion species. Bacteria are some of the most intelligent species on this planet, so are viruses. And so there's this question, without, getting all the agency away from us so that we can then wash our hands of our involvement, there's an interchange that I think is really important for us to look at. And that's where the field of planetary health comes in. There is a journal called Planetary Health, which is a Lancet journal, that talks about many of these issues. So I'm arguing that the coronavirus is a reflection of human activity in the world currently, or better yet, that industrial activity which has become globalized. For example, If air quality were better, we would have fewer cases and less transmission. If, for example, smoking, which was entirely invented by an industry to extract money, there was no commercial use of tobacco before it became colonized, we would have better health outcomes. And if obesity wasn't an issue, which has to do with the food industry and advertising, we would have less dysrhogistic pre-existing conditions. So all of these are human-made problems, and they have to do with what I call industrial pandemics. So we would not accept somebody to say, well, I spread germs all over town today, but I bought coronavirus offsets, so we're good, right? We have this notion that carbon credits, right, will solve us, right? These are dispensations, like indulgences, like from priests. And we see very clearly from the data that our air pollution is indeed a main factor in the transmission, especially long distance transmission of the coronavirus, right? Fine particulate matter of 2.5 millimeters, or not millimeters, micrometers or less, which is called PM 2.5. As well as sulfur dioxide, nitrogen dioxide, carbon monoxide, and ozone affect our airways through inhalation and exacerbate the susceptibility to and severity of respiratory virus infections. So we have created an Umwelt that is very conducive to this and many other pathogenic viruses. And part of the problem is that we've been focusing on, a deus ex machina, where we don't have to really fundamentally change the underlying processes that brought this about, but instead just, provide sort of a personalized medicine approach, right, to try to sustain the unsustainable, as Ingelford Bluthorn would say. And this iconic photo, which Rolling Stone called the photo of 2020, right? Here's a senior citizen center. They're just recovering from first wave of COVID, wear a mask, wash your hands, social distance, stay safe in California. And, the biggest wildfire that's ever happened occurs. So this is something that we have to deal with. My colleague at UCSF, Rupa Maria, she looks at how human health, soil health, climate, environmental health, and plant health are all harmed by synthetic pesticides, herbicides, and fertilizers, right? That these affect pathways along each of these dimensions, and that they are not separate, but rather from a planetary health perspective, that we are dealing with a crisis that cannot be solved at a lower level of intervention, but one that requires upstream approaches. Already in 1962, Rachel Carson ironically wrote, or wrote Riley, "It is ironic to think that man might determine his own future by something so seemingly trivial as the sex." We know very well from Rockström et al., as well as Kate Rayworth's donut economics, that we are far beyond exceeding these capacities as a planet. And why I think planetary health can help us look at interspecies, because through the health framework, they're looking at delocalization of health, the butterfly effect, that our own health is only as good as that of our neighbors, and that Earth systems are the basis of all health, and that non-human beings, ecosystems, and human flourishing are intertwined. We know from an endosemiotic perspective that we have a gut microbiome and even a brain microbiome, where they're doing brain samples and finding a high level of microbial sequences which they were not expecting, and that's not just due to contamination, but reflect resident symbiont microbes. We know exosemiotically that we have cued agency, just as David Chalmers talks us about an iPhone being the extension of our body, right? An appendage, our external memory, just as Appia Anthony Appiah talks about that we are situationally cued, right? You put the same person in a different situation, they will have different outcomes. So we're not being puppeteered by anybody, but rather our interactions with our environment are supervening on our experience of that interaction. So I asked the question, what would reconciliative agency look like? What would it take to get beyond this very, I would say, toxic form of individualism, right? Where we aim to imagine, okay, that we got there ourselves without thousands and millions of people contributing, making our food, cleaning our toilets, building these things, and also providing the atmosphere, all the microbes that have created this atmosphere for us. So looking at holobiont or non-animal ontologies, I found to be very helpful. For example, we have, how do you say, plant or fungi models of ontology, which have been very useful to break out of this sort of individualistic mentality. Could also look at Alan Rayner's notions of degrees of freedom or semiotic freedom, and looking at our co-constitution in that way, or Danielle Allen's notion of shared sacrifice in her book, Talking to Strangers. Some of us might be aware of our cortical or sensory homunculus, right? That's how the brain maps on different sense organs, and how, for example, our hands occupy a huge part of our brain, whereas, say, our neck is barely a blip in our cortex. And I'm wondering if we also have an agental homunculus, right? Do we have a distorted scale of agency, right? Where the idea of I is this singular thing, just as, say, our lips and our tongue are a huge part of how our brain maps our body. Do non-humans have capacities for self-liberation? And how can we foster non-human self-liberation without it coming at the cost of human liberation? And we can ask, is interspecies liberation a zero-sum game? So finally, and I'm on my penultimate slide here, attending to others. So I conjecture that if we wish to better address unmet human needs, especially our quote unquote animal, interspecies, and ecological needs, then we must pay more attention to the meanings of other organisms which make us up, either biologically or ecologically. That's endosemiotically or exosemiotically. And that these biological others, from viruses and bacteria to plants, fungi, and animals, which form parts of our life, either in terms of contact dermally, in terms of our respiration, or imbibed, must be accounted for and better understood, not just managed. And finally, those of you who might be familiar with Riane Eisler's work, she talks about domination and partnership societies. There's this question of, with our co-constituents of our own agency, again, endosemiotically and exosemiotically, are we taking a domination approach of a singular I, or are we taking a more synesthetic approach of partnership, of being open to the moods of Heidegger, the feelings, right, of Merleau-Ponty, and many others who have directed us towards these reference points. So we need to have interventions in the world that do not cause more harm for our fellow symbionts on this planet. Thank you very much.
Excellent. So if you could stop share screen. Perfect. Great. So anyone who has questions, just put a hand up over in the chat. Looks like Tori's got one and Ludmila's got one. So Tori first, or no, that's a clap. Tori.
Hi. Thank you, Yogi. That was really great. I like your final picture. I think you probably don't mean seriously that the selfish virus any more than you would advocate for the selfish gene. And I just wanted to know, I mean, there's the big, debate whether or not viruses are really alive because they can't replicate on their own. To me, clearly they are artifacts of living organisms, and there's new evidence to that effect that they may have originated from exosomes. I don't know if you're involved in that conversation, but one new piece of evidence that's really interesting is there's a gene that's activated in neurons called the ARC gene, and it has a viral origin. And it triggers the production of an exosome that has a protein capsid that looks very much like a virus. And it's responsible for communicating to the other neurons to build long-term memory. So it's a communication device, and it's bringing, they believe it has RNA in it. And so it's bringing that information to other cells. So I just wanted to probably viruses are not alive, but they do look like tools that are created by organisms, by living cells.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I wasn't aware of that recent research. I'm still, viruses are a frontier for me. I know the work of Villarreal have been really interesting in bringing this awareness of sort of the viral origins of life. I know that a lot of Terry's work is also, when he's talking about the autogen, he's looking more or less at a virus model. And so if these questions of, what's like the minimal, what's minimal life, right? Is it a cell? Is it a virus? It's super interesting to look at the origins of life in that way. But obviously, for viruses to have come from the exosome, I think that would be a very interesting alternative hypothesis, especially if they have this transport system, like you said, mimics neuron function.
Okay, we got a comment down in the chat from Robert Bohat. Maybe viruses could fall into the pre-living category mentioned by Jay Rose. I love the comparison, the theological metaphor of this carbon credits as priestly or clerical indulgences. I just love this, and it makes me think about what you said last night about Schmidt and about the political and the theological.
Okay, sorry.
If you wanted to say anything more about that, that'd be good. Also about the puppet master. I know this is a topic I bring up a lot with you, but about there being no hidden hands, but then some dark emergent force, or maybe even related to this cunning of reason that you were talking about before, if you wanted to say anything about that.
Sure, thanks, Tyler. I think there's a whole bunch of bundled questions here with, you could say constructive, right, to put it in that philosophical category. And we know that from a biosemiotic perspective, organisms construct niches and niches construct organisms, right? So you have this sort of looping effect. And as I wrote a couple, I am a fake loop paper looking at how symbolism and symbolic communication has this tendency to eclipse and to undermine the sort of semiotic grounding of the symbols itself. I think that part of acknowledging our interspecies agency is comes with not just an epistemic humility, but also a diversity or a neuroplasticity, which must transgress, not to transgress, but just to be free, right? So this is where I'm very interested in this question, interspecies agency and freedom. So this question of how we could possibly be more free. And that's what I'm arguing for, is that kurz gesagt, you could say Kant got it mostly right with freedom and autonomy, right? He said, it's sort of following this larger process or order. But I'm going to say we need a sort of a Kantian notion of freedom as autonomy, but as interspecies sort of process, so that fighting against the world, which has been the sort of dominant Enlightenment notion of freedom, where that I've achieved everything despite the world, right? So I'm constantly in opposition. That itself comes from a sort of refusal to look in the ways that I'm constituted, right? To get back to your question, there's this notion that I believe the more that we can honor our sort of endowment to the more than human world, both organismic and you could say non-abiotic, the more we're actually able to come from a place that doesn't assume sort of an outcome, a trajectory that's fixed.
Yep, totally. I see Philip's got his hand up.
Thank you, Yogi, for your presentation. I have just a quick question. So if we knew something more about ontology of viruses, bacteria, and so on, how would we treat current pandemic differently in your eyes?
Thank you for that question. Well, we have viruses inside of us. We have bacteria, and without them we would die, right? So I think fundamentally we need to acknowledge that one of the things that we're doing is that we have been killing off, say, our gut microbiome, which is mutualistic to us or commensal, and we've been creating a vacuum. And of course, nature abhors a vacuum, and so it renders us weaker to parasitism. So I would say we need to, instead of focus on fighting or winning the war on drugs or the war on coronavirus or whatever the next war is, instead need to do the Buckminster Fuller thing and create better alternatives. Right, we need to create healthier immune systems. We need to maybe shut down airports for a few months and let certain strains sort of peter out, and then not let any more emerge before we open back up international travel. I think that this would be something that, if we had a little bit more foresight, would work.
All right, we got a couple chats down in the chat box, but we got to move on to the next presentation. Our second presenter. So thank you, Yogi.